Hello, my name's Elaine Murphy and I work for the Columbia Sioux Watershed Council, and we're here to learn about owls tonight. Owls are really fascinating creatures. I have led bird walks and been watching birds for over 30 years. I'm out almost every weekend, and I've been to all of the parks around the Portland, Vancouver area, and yet I still get very excited whenever I see or hear an owl. And there's a reason for that. Most owls are nocturnal. They come out at night, and so we are less likely to be able to find them. During the daytime, they are masters of camouflage. Owls like to roost right up close to the trunk of a tree, and their feathers look just like the bark of a tree. So it can be kind of hard to find an owl. You can increase your chances of seeing an owl by knowing a few simple tips. Probably the item that helps me find the most owls is by watching the behavior of other birds. Owls are predators, and predators generally rely on sneaking up on their prey. And so if a bird comes across an owl, it's going to let every other bird know. Mobbing behavior is most vigorous in the springtime when birds are nesting, but it can happen any time of the year. I've had my best great horned owl sightings by watching the behavior of crows. If you see crows dive bombing one spot over and over again, always check it out. A lot of times it's a red-tailed hawk, but sometimes it might be a great horned owl or some other kind of owl. So watch the behavior of other birds. Another thing is that owls are very often creatures of habit. They will roost or sleep during the day in the same place over and over again. And their droppings might accumulate underneath the perch where they are, or down the sides of a tree trunk, and their droppings look just like other birds' droppings. They're kind of liquid white wash, and so whenever I'm on a trail, I always watch the path, and if I see a lot of bird droppings, I look up, and I may well see an owl. Another thing that gets left under their perches are owl pellets. We're going to talk about owl pellets a little bit more later, but owl pellets, the bird coughs them up. And a lot of times they look like scat, like furry coyote scat, but they also accumulate underneath a roost where the owls have been roosting. There are some shelters. Fern Hill Wetlands out in Forest Grove has a couple of shelters where you can observe birds, and Sauvie Island has some shelters. And owls will get in and out of the rain too, so very often if you walk up on these shelters, you'll find owl pellets on the railings or on the ground. So watch out for that. Another thing to look out for is the behavior of people. If there is an owl close to a trail or a snowy owl out at the coast, very often you'll see a line of cars and people with binoculars and spotting scopes. And birders are generally very friendly. If you don't run up and make a lot of noise, go up and ask what they're looking at, and you may find an owl that way. So owls are very well adapted to their nighttime lifestyle. And the first thing that comes to mind are their eyes. Owls have really big eyes and really good night vision. Their eyes are so big in their heads that they cannot move their eyes from side to side. And we're going to see a picture of an owl skull. They have bony rings that hold their eyes in place, so they can't move their eyes. Now, our eyes are very mobile. We're always moving our eyes around. But owls make up for it by having a very flexible neck. An owl can start out looking straight, turn to the left, and look over its right shoulder. So if you give it a try, first of all, keep your eyes straight ahead and turn just your head. I'm looking over in that direction. I can see a little bit behind me, but not that much. If I move just my eyes and keep my head straight, I can't see that far. If I turn my head and my eyes, I can see the screen behind me, but I can't see it well. But an owl can see very well. And another thing about the owls is they get depth perception. You've probably seen a film of an owl moving its head from side to side. Or maybe you've been lucky enough to see a real owl, a live owl do that. Well, what they're doing, if you hold your hand in front of your face and move your head from side to side and check out what you see. To me, when I do that, my hand appears to be moving a lot. the back wall is hardly moving at all. So the owl is getting some depth perception. The other thing that owls have to help them be able to hunt and survive at night is really good hearing. Some of the forest owls, like the Boreal Owl that lives in very dark places, their ears are not symmetrical. One ear is lower and larger than the other one, and they're pointed in slightly different directions. Owls do need some light to be able to see. Not like bats. Bats use echolocation and they can get by in complete darkness. If you sealed off all the light from this room and let a bat go, it could get around without bumping into any obstacles. If you sealed off all the light and let an owl go, it might bump into things. However, because of its hearing, if you were to scatter dry leaves on the floor and let a live mouse go, chances are that owl is going to be able to pounce on that mouse the first time because it's using its hearing. The sound of the mouse hits its ear just slightly differently than it hits the other ear. And so from that, the owl can figure out where the mouse is. Another thing that helps owls to be able to hunt at night is that they have an adaptation on their feathers. It's a fringe, and we're going to see a picture of this in a little bit, that helps the owl to fly absolutely silently. If the owl was making a lot of noise, then it wouldn't be able to hear the mouse. And if it was making a lot of noise, the mouse would hear the owl coming. I've been in my backyard and had a small sparrow fly right overhead and I can hear flap, 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 flap. But if an owl flies by, it's absolutely silent. So all of these adaptations help the owl to be able to hunt at night. Now, I mentioned owl pellets. Owl pellets, like other birds, birds do not have teeth. The birds of prey generally catch and kill with their talons, and then if it's a small animal, like a vole, they may just pop it down and swallow it whole. If it's a bigger animal like a rabbit or a squirrel, they'll use their sharply hooked beaks to tear it apart. But they're left with a lot of leftovers that they can't digest. So when they swallow a vole, it goes down into their throat. Birds have a gizzard which grinds up the food. The meat passes into the owl's stomach, but it's left with essentially a fur ball. If you've ever had a pet cat cough up a fur ball, it's in the throat and it's tightly compacted with bones and fur. If the owl has eaten a bird, then it would have feathers in the pellet. I have dissected owl pellets and found insect exoskeletons in the owl pellet. So the owl pellet is coughed back up. It's not the same as vomit. It's not coming from the owl's stomach, it's coming from its throat. So dissecting an owl pellet can be a really fun project to do. You can tear it apart, and there are charts that you can get on the internet that show the different types of animals that might be in an owl pellet and what shape the bones are. A little word of advice. I had a friend who did a lot of hiking, and he came across owl pellets, and he knew that I dissected owl pellets and that I sometimes taught classes where we dissected owl pellets. So he brought me a Ziploc bag of a lot of owl pellets that he found out in the forest. Well, I thought, this is great, someday I will dissect these, and I put that Ziploc bag out in my garage. Well, the owl pellets had been out on the forest floor, and they had things in them. And the things hatched. And when they hatched, they chewed their way out of the plastic bag. They were big insect larvae, and chewed their way into my cardboard boxes of class supplies. And it was not fun getting rid of them. So if you want to dissect an owl pellet, my advice is to buy them. You can buy them online. There are a lot of places that sell owl pellets, and they have been sterilized so they won't hatch out bugs or other things. I did have a woman in one of my classes one time say, well, you can sterilize them yourself, just put them in your oven. Your house will smell bad for a few days, but you can sterilize your own owl pellet. That's not a high recommendation. So dissecting an owl pellet is a lot of fun, but buy one online. They come wrapped up in aluminum foil, so that's a good way to explore owl pellets. So we're going to see some slides, and we're going to talk about owls that live in the Portland, Vancouver area. owl skull. This is a great horned owl skull. These are the bony plates, or they're called sclerotic rings, and they keep the eyeball long as opposed to round like a ping pong ball. And that gives the owl its good vision, but it also means the owl can't move its eyes in its head. I have a replica of an owl skull. This is an exact copy, it's plastic, of a great horned owl skull. So you can see it's not really very big. The great horned owl is a big owl, but a lot of the bulk is feathers. This is a side view of what the owl skull looks like and the shape of the eyeball. It fits into those rings. And again, that gives the owl its good vision. This is a picture of a Boreal Owl Skull, and this is showing how the ears are not symmetrical. We call these our ears, but in fact they're just flaps. What we hear with are the bones and membranes inside of our skull. So we can't see the owl's ears because they're covered with feathers, but they have openings that are about the same place, but they're not straight across from each other. They're not the same shape. And this one's oriented that way, and that one goes that way. So that gives the owl really good hearing and depth perception by sound. This is a close-up of the owl's flight feathers. This fringe is kind of like the teeth on a comb, and that is what breaks up the turbulence when the owl flies and allows it to fly absolutely silently. This is a mouse's worst nightmare, the talons of an owl. And it's also showing another adaptation that some owls have. When we think of birds' legs and feet, we think of scales. Most birds do not have feathered legs or feathered toes, whereas the owl's feathers, and they're kind of specialized feathers that looks almost more like fur than feathers, and many owls have their feathers go all the way down to their talons, and they believe that helps protect the owl from being bitten by whatever it's catching. And here's our first owl. This is the barn owl, B-A-R-N, as in big red barn. And barn owls do in fact like to live in barns. They like to nest in barns. For a long time, farmers would persecute these owls. They felt like they were after their livestock and that they were harmful predators. But a family of barn owls eats almost exclusively mice, and they eat a lot of mice when they're feeding young. So a lot of farmers have realized that barn owls are a good thing to have around. They keep the mice and other rodents out of their stored grain or their crops or their livestock feed. So a lot of times now farmers will actually encourage barn owls to nest in their barns. We can see here, this is called a facial disc, this heart shape on the face, and they believe that helps to funnel the sound into the owl's ears. So also help it with good hearing at night. You can also see a bit of a difference here in the size of the young. With songbirds, very often the mother, the female, will lay her eggs, and she may lay her clutch over the course of a couple of days, but she doesn't incubate them. Incubate is to sit on them and keep them nice and warm, and they don't develop unless they're being incubated. So when the female is done laying all of her eggs, then she will incubate them. So all of the young, even if they're laid a couple days apart, the eggs are laid, then all of the young hatch at about the same time. Owls don't do that. The mother owl will lay her first egg and she'll start incubating it right away. In general, birds of prey have fewer young than other birds because it takes a lot to raise a baby bird of prey. It has to be fed for longer, it has to learn how to hunt, and so most birds of prey don't have as many young. But the first egg hatches and that baby starts to develop, and baby birds grow very quickly. So you can see this one is bigger, he's got some of his adult feathers growing in. Then the next egg hatches. Well, when the parents come back, they will feed the biggest, loudest mouth in the nest. And so they will keep feeding that oldest chick until maybe it's full, it's not hungry anymore, or it's tired and wants to take a nap. Then you'll start feeding the next one. Well, in a good year, when the weather is not severe, when both parents survive and are bringing food back to the nest, when the habitat is good, then there'll be enough food to go around and all the young will survive. In a bad year, however, maybe only one or two, maybe only the oldest chick is going to get enough to eat, and the other chicks may not survive. That sounds like kind of a harsh strategy, but for all the effort that parents go to nest, to lay the eggs, to protect the nest, to bring food in, it's better to have at least one young survive than to distribute the food evenly and have them all die because there just isn't enough to go around. So the barn owl has kind of a screechy sound. And the barn owl very often gives its sound as it's flying low over a field. Barn owls do indeed like open areas way more than any kind of other habitat. So this is the sound of a barn owl.
Barn owl.
That last sound is the clacking of the owl's bill. When they're alarmed, they will very often snap their bill rapidly. This is a screech owl. This is not the screech owl we get here in Portland. It's a whiskered screech owl, which is found in the southwest of the United States. I include this slide, though, because the screech owl has feather tufts, just like the great horned owl and the long-eared owl. They're not horns, they're not ears, they're just feather tufts. But I like this photo because it shows that the screech owl's feather tufts are smoothed down. If the owl is very alert, those tufts are very up high. If the owl is calm, they can relax them. They have control over those feathers, just like other birds have control over their crests. The Steller's jay has a crest. If it's really alert, it will lift it. If it's calm, it will smooth it down. This is a western screech owl, and you can see it's a dark brown color, and that is what our owl looks like. This owl, I took this slide myself. The other slides I got from the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, but this was about 8:30 in the morning at Bryant Woods Park in Lake Oswego. And I was walking along a trail, and there were about a dozen little songbirds making a racket. You can usually, even if you're not familiar with bird sounds, you can usually tell that birds are alarmed. It's very high-pitched, very rapid, and I heard all these songbirds giving their alarm calls, and they're all flittering around, and I looked up, and the screech owl, about 10 feet above my head, was sticking its head out of a box. And you can see those feather tufts are way up. The owl knew I was there. So that is one way that you can encourage owls, if you have a backyard, is by putting up a box, because the owls may use them for nesting, and if they don't use them for nesting, they may use them as a place to sleep during the day. So this is the screech owl. Birders have different ways of trying to remember what a bird sounds like. Sometimes they use words, sometimes they use other sound associations. Sometimes people think of the western screech owl as sounding, if you dropped a ping pong on a hard floor, you'll hear bump, 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 bump. So see if that helps you remember the sound of the western screech owl.
Western screech owl.
So we think of owls hooting, but they make a lot of other sounds as well. And here's the big guy. This is the great horned owl. The great horned owl is a big owl, but it's really quite a common owl in this area. Very often if you see a red-tailed hawk during the day, it might be an area, a habitat that great horned owls would like. And by hunting at night instead of during the day, they don't compete with the red-tailed hawks. So the great horned owl, again, has big feather tufts that stick up. And if you've ever seen a movie or a commercial or a television show where they play the sound of an owl, they have probably played the sound of a great horned owl, because it's whenever anybody thinks of an owl, it's usually the great horned owl that they think of.
Great horned owl.
The great horned owls, they actually call at a different pitch. The female's hoot is lower than the male's. So if you're lucky enough to hear two owls calling back and forth, you can tell which is a female and which is the male. If I just hear one great horned owl, I could not tell you which one it is. But if you're hearing two calling back and forth, you can tell which is the male and which is the female. This is a great horned owl ready to pounce. Its eyes are focused. Feet are out with its talons ready. The wings and tail are spread to slow it down as it gets close to the ground. This is the northern pygmy owl. The pygmy owl is a very small owl, and it has a whistling call. The pygmy owl is very often active during the daytime, so you may hear it during the day. It's an easy sound to imitate. There's a whistle sound, and I heard a pygmy owl at Oxbow Park in Gresham one time in the morning during the day. So this is what it sounds like.
Northern pygmy owl.
And this is one of my favorite owls. This is the burrowing owl. The burrowing owl gets its name because it does, in fact, nest in burrows. And it's actually a very small owl. I don't usually see burrowing owls in the west side of the state. They are more often found on the eastern side. I've seen them at Malheur in northeast Oregon. Burrowing owls did indeed show up at Basket Slough a number of years ago. But the burrowing owl nests in burrows. It will very often take over a prairie dog burrow, sometimes by eating the occupant. It may move into an abandoned badger hole. It will not mess with a badger. Badgers are too big and too fierce. But if it cannot find an abandoned burrow to use, if you look at how these strong, sturdy legs, if the ground is soft enough, the burrowing owl can excavate its own burrow. I don't have a recording of the baby burrowing owls, but I have heard, and I need to find a recording of it because I'd love to hear it. I've heard that they have a remarkable survival strategy. The baby burrowing owls can make a sound like a rattlesnake. So if you were if you were looking in a prairie dog hole thinking you're going to find a nice lunch, if you were a hungry coyote or a person that was not smart enough to know you don't stick your hand down into a hole, if a coyote poked his nose into a burrow, the baby burrowing owl is giving off the sound of a rattlesnake is going to make that coyote back up really quickly. The adult burrowing owls make one of my favorite owl sounds. It starts out kind of sounding like a quail, I think, and ends up more like a lunatic chicken. So see what you think of it.
Burrowing owl.
This is a northern spotted owl. And I have never seen a spotted owl yet. I would like to get to some old growth forest, which is the type of forest that they prefer. I know they're up in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. They were controversial and still are controversial because they depend on old growth forest, and loggers, those are the best trees to get, nice big trees. So the thing about the spotted owl though, and the old growth forest is it's not just the spotted owl, it's an entire ecosystem. And if you were to eliminate the spotted owls, then you would probably be eliminating a lot of other animals too, because of the food web. It's not just a food chain, but the owls eat flying squirrels, which spread mushroom spores around, and the mushroom spores can promote the growth of new trees. So all kinds of things are interrelated, and if you were to get rid of the spotted owls, you'd be losing a lot of other animals in the ecosystem as well.
Spotted owl.
And here's the barred owl. It's B-A-R-R-E-D, as in bars or stripes, as opposed to barn owl, which we saw first. The barred owl is a relatively recent addition to the Pacific Northwest. A lot of introduced species were moved to areas where they didn't normally live by humans, but the barred owl got here on its own. It gradually increased its range westward and southward. When I first started watching birds, I had never heard of a barred owl. And now pretty much any place I go in the Portland, Vancouver area, there is likely to be a barred owl there. Now the barred owl is also controversial. If you look back at the spotted owl, you'll see they look very similar, but the spotted owl has spots and the barred owl has stripes. Well, the spotted owl relies on old growth forest, but the barred owl is not that particular. It can live in old growth forest, it can live in second growth forest, it can live in more open areas. And the problem for the spotted owl is that the barred owl is more adaptable. Again, it can live in different habitats. It's more aggressive. So very often when it moves into an area where there are spotted owls, it may drive out the spotted owls. It may chase them away, or it may kill them. The last thing that might happen is that they are closely enough related that you now have hybrids. So you have a mix of barred owls and spotted owls, and you don't have any more spotted owls. So they are considered a problem for the spotted owl. Again, birders use devices to try to remember what an owl sounds like, or what any bird sounds like. The barred owl is supposed to be saying, "Oh, cooks for you! Oh, cooks for you all!" So see if you can hear that in the sound.
Barred owl.
Here comes a whole sentence. This is the long-eared owl. Again, not ears, but feather tufts. The long-eared owl is one that I would normally expect to find in eastern Oregon. Occasionally, one or two might show up on this side of the mountains, but generally I think of long-eared owl as being eastern Oregon.
Long-eared owl.
this is a short-eared owl. The short-eared owl is, one of my favorite words is crepuscular. Nocturnal means most active at nighttime. Diurnal is most active during the day. Crepuscular is dawn and dusk, those periods between light and dark. So that's when you're most likely to see short-eared owls. They are low to the ground. In eastern Oregon, I very often see them on split rail fences or towards evening. They're described as having a moth-like flight as they fly low across the fields. Coming back from Malheur one year, I was heading straight north, and we counted, I think, a dozen short-eared owls in a 15-mile stretch by the side of the highway. Short-eared owls do occasionally show up in Portland, Broughton Beach, right across on the Columbia River, right across from the airport. Very often in wintertime, there might be a short-eared owl there or two. So, and they do have little feather tufts, which they can raise or lower.
Short-eared owl.
This is the saw-whet owl. Saw-whet owl is also a very small owl, just ever so slightly bigger than the pygmy owl. It nests in holes in trees. Saw-whet owls are forest-loving birds. I have heard them at Tryman Creek State Park down by Lake Oswego. And the recording that I have of the saw-whet owl has a distinct pattern to it, but I've listened to a lot of other recordings and it doesn't have that same pattern. So you may hear a saw-whet owl that doesn't have the pattern that you're going to hear. It's a whistle sound, just slightly lower pitched than the pygmy owl.
Northern saw-whet owl.
And that last sound is how they get their name. Whet is W-H-E-T, and that's the width of a saw blade. So someone thought that that sound sounded like dragging a handsaw across a log. That whoosh, whoosh. So that's how they got their name. And this is the snowy owl. I don't have a recording of the snowy owl. Generally, they're pretty quiet. They usually live way far north, but they're what's called an eruptive species. Periodically, they come down as far as Oregon in large numbers. Almost every winter, I would say, there might be one or two snowy owls showing up in Oregon. eBird, which is put out by the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, is a good way to find out if birds are in the area. And OBOL, O-B-O-L, Oregon Birders Online, is another way to find out what birds are in the area. And also Portland Audubon Society has a recording of, it's called a rare bird alert, but they will also mention, fall migration is underway. There are a lot of sandhill cranes around. So those are resources to check out for what birds are in the area. So the snowy owls live way up north, and they eat lemmings, the little furry guys. And lemming populations go in cycles. The lemmings have more and more babies. There are more and more lemmings until finally the lemmings have eaten all the greenery in sight and their population crashes. It used to be thought that that's when the owls came down in large numbers. It's roughly 4 to 7 years. We'll get an eruption of snowy owls this far south. Well, they thought that, all right, the lemming population is crashing, that's why the owls come south. But in fact, they found out that it's the other way around. But back when I heard, I'd never seen a snowy owl, I have an office job during the week, and I have classes scheduled on the weekends, so I don't cancel my bird walks or my classes. But years ago, I heard that it was a good snowy owl year. That was the year that a snowy owl took up residence at a mobile home park in Forest Grove. And there was one down in Corvallis. Well, there were a lot of snowy owls, or a number of snowy owls at the coast. So I worked Monday through Friday at my office job, and I have classes on the weekend, so I had to take a weekday off in a hurry to go see these owls. So So I went to my boss and I said, the lemming population crashed and I have to have Friday off. And he said, well, okay, you can have Friday off, but explain the lemming bit. Well, as it turns out, it's just the opposite. The owls and other birds too will respond to the availability of food. So when there are lots and lots of lemmings, the owls have more babies. More young survive. And then when the winter comes, there are a lot of babies around and not as much food, and that's when the owls move south in larger numbers. And very often it's the immature owls, the first owls of the year, that come this far south. The South Jetty on the coast is a good place. Fort Stevens State Park is a good place to see snowy owls if they're here. And again, you're driving down one of those roads in Fort Stevens State Park and you see a whole bunch of people pulled over with cameras with great big lenses and spotting scopes. Stop and see, and you might be able to see a spotted owl. If you're familiar with parking lot C, there's a platform, elevated platform, and I have been up there and watched snowy owls flying by, so it's a good place to go in the winter time. And I'm hoping, I don't know when the last big snowy owl year was, but I'm hoping that maybe this winter there will be a number of them coming down. Oh, and they're very active during the day, so they're used to 24 hours of daylight in the far north. So they're not nocturnal. The first time I saw snowy owls was that weekend that I took the Friday off, and my daughter and I went to Fort Stevens State Park, and I spotted the first 5 plastic Safeway bags, and she spotted the first snowy owl. And at one time we had, I think, 5 owls in view at the same time, 3 in one tree. So it's a treat, and I'm hoping that this winter will be a good snowy owl year. And this is the great gray owl. This is one of the largest owls we have in the United States. And they are in Oregon. Again, I tend to think of them at northeast Oregon. They have nesting platforms set up on federal lands. One did make it to the west side a number of years ago at Silver Falls State Park, just south off of I-5. I saw my only great gray owls at the Lapine Golf Course one time. They were nesting there. And they're very often out during the daytime. Okay. I'll turn the lights on. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to owls. And at the Watershed Council, we are going to have an owl prowl scheduled where we actually go out and listen to owls. A word about recordings and owls is when you, or any other bird for that matter, when you play a recording of a bird, you're actually playing a rival. So birds give most of their song during the nesting season when they're setting up their territories and trying to attract a mate. So if you play a recording of a bird, you're actually playing a rival in their territory. So I do occasionally use recordings of the great horned owl and the screech owl, but I use them in places very limited, briefly. If the owl responds, I stop. I'll do it a few times. The great horned owl and the screech owl are very common owls. Birders can be a little bit crazy. One time there was a trogon north of the border down south in the southwest, and all these crazy birders came from all over the country, and they were all playing recordings of this trogon because they only had a short time to see the bird. Well, the bird took off. It had trogons all around, and it was intimidated by it. So you don't want to say, oh, I've got an owl in my yard and it's so neat, I go out there every night and the owl responds. Well, you're actually stressing the bird if you do it too much. Again, I feel okay doing it rarely, occasionally with very common birds. Nobody is driving to Oregon from Florida to see a great horned owl. And so, but it is something to be aware of. You don't want to keep doing it. So do come along. The Columbia Slough Watershed Council has a lot of good events. You can check out our website. And I hope to see you on an owl prowl, or in the summertime we do bat classes too. And thank you very much.